Good evening, gamers. How are we all doing today? Today, I'm going to be discussing one of the most interesting things to watch dry: paint. Now, with painting, it took me a long time to figure out what my style is. And with a lot of my most recent designs, I've sort of leaned into a certain aesthetic. But today I just want to discuss some do's and don'ts that come with painting and texturing your ship. It took me a long time when I first started playing this game to actually start painting my ships. And after a lot of trial and error over the last year, I've learned that painting ships is really just as important as the actual design of the ship. It can make a huge impact on the overall feel of the ship. This, of course, is the Church of the Bonus Car. For those not in the know, check my Reddit profile. There's quite a bit of information on that there. But I've been told this is kind of similar to Warhammer 40k. Never participated in that fandom, I'm sorry. But I do see the aesthetic with the gold trim and the scale of it. But when it comes to painting and texturing, it's got to be one of the most important parts of designing a ship. And there are 3 key points I keep in mind while painting a ship. Always use bright colors for interiors. The way this game's lighting engine works is that if you have a dark texture, even something fairly light like battered black, it will simply just eat all of the light that hits it. So if you want your people to be able to see inside, you better use something like sci-fi white, battered white, or any of the lighter colors like that. Color coding different components, armor layers, or sections can make it significantly easier to distinguish ship's functions at a glance, especially in larger builds. So instead of building the entire thing all at once, what I like to do generally is paint while I build, like a psychopath, and that way I can understand this is one armor plate, so it's battered black. This is a section under the armor plate, sort of like a steel bar under it. On each side you can see it, so it's battered red. The center portion's white. Stuff like that can really help your ship pop out visually. And this is something I struggle with quite a bit, is neon or retro future textures are fantastic as accents. Just look at this beautiful gold. That's actually not using retro future, that's using the actual gold texture. They make fantastic accents, but they should be used as sparingly as possible to avoid making your eyes rot out of your head. Oh. Prime example for the overuse of retro future is this thing. I don't necessarily hate this, but I think it would have been a lot better if the outsides here were a sci-fi black and these trims were gold. I think that would overall result in a better ship. You don't need to have a cohesive paint job. Ships that are painted like visual noise can be pretty fun, but knowing the fundamentals of keeping things sort of similar can really help in a lot of cases with general visual cohesion. This one, for example, looks like a bunch of random modules duct taped together, but because everything is color-coded, I don't think it suffers visually from it. I think it all, in its own special little way, I think it all holds together. As with everything, your paint should make sense for the lore that you have for your world. I'm the type of psychopath who will paint while building, and it helps my designs from being too samey. Slapping paint on after the fact, in my case, generally leads to more bland results. Give each section its own personality as you build. Consider how your lore dictates. Painting individual sections can really give personality to a build, and can even help out with your lore. You want your ships to feel lived in, probably. As in, how are they actually manufactured in your world? Are they prefabricated parts that are being welded together after the fact? Like in this case, how you could imagine that one shop would design the center portion with all its wiring, and then another shop would basically stamp out these metal rings. Or are they built in one go, like this pod skipper, which would just be kind of built in a garage or an assembly line, all on site? These factors have a lot to do with how my ships look, because the first thing I think about, especially with my small grid, is how are these things being stamped out or assembled? Dark textures are fantastic for hiding imperfections or making key elements stand out. Battered black is usually my go-to just because it works in so many cases. It's one of the better looking panels, and it's light enough to where you can actually see it, even in darker conditions or in space. And even under light, it sort of gives off a more off-gray feel. But do keep in mind, these things still suck up light in the game's lighting engine. Just don't overdo it, or you won't be able to see it. One of the best textures for black is neon lights and carbon fiber. I think those really elevate the level of black because your brain just sort of disregards it. You really can't see the black unless it's super obvious. This here is one of the first ships I ever built. I think it's the first large grid I ever did build. But it sort of elevates a point of mine that you shouldn't just be lazily adding stripes to things. I don't think it overall does well for designs, and I think it's kind of, in a lot of cases, it usually doesn't work out. Now, of course, I'm not doing a fantastic job of striping this thing, but yeah, these aren't the best colors to work with. But honestly, if you can avoid simply painting the entire thing, putting a stripe down the middle, experiment, mess around. The worst you're going to do is make something visually interesting but ugly. Hazard is one of those textures that... anybody that's played this game for an amount of time will know Hazard either works very well, I think it looks pretty nice in this case, or very badly. Like, you know what looks better than this? Actually, nothing. That looks better as a yellow safety panel than using Hazard. It's truly atrocious. Hazard should be used sparingly, as it's a fairly garish texture. Along with neon. Neon's a weird texture to work with. But you should add it to low hanging bars, low ceilings, any moving parts like landing gears tend to work very well with this. They can really make your ship feel lived in, and I highly recommend using them even for combat ships. But overall, Hazard texture has, in some cases, a 9 out of 10 use, but in some cases, -5 out of 10. I'm going to drive to Keen's office, and silver is one of those textures that I feel is very slept on. And I understand why. It can't be used as a base or a trim effectively at all. But one use I've found is that you can use it for kitchens, railings, staircases, to sort of help almost increase the visibility of an object, say this door. Silver is a very hard texture to fit in, but I highly recommend at least using them for your railings. I think it will make a pretty big difference for your interiors, especially since a lot of people just make their railings the same color of your ship. Please don't do that. It looks terrible. As I'm sure anybody who's played this block game has noticed, the textures on panels are bullshit. This is ugly. There's no texture wrapping, and most don't work well due to, no matter what most of the textures are, they have this stupid little zigzag in there. The tragic one's carbon fiber. Why does that have a zigzag in there? That doesn't make any sense. There are some that don't. Concrete works okay, but it has this stupid looping texture. And in most cases where you'd be using this like roads and parking lots, you can only really use this as a patching tool. There are some that I think look rather good. The corrugated armor used in certain situations can help quite a bit, because the developers on this one and not a whole lot of others actually took into consideration that panels shouldn't be horrendous to look at. Battered is an example as a normal, non-garish texture. This is probably a fairly safe bet. There's Retro Future, which is honestly pretty hard to go wrong with. Depending on the ship design, of course. And these should be oriented in different ways to make sense for whatever you're building. And of course, my nemesis, the weldless panels. This little seam right here, I don't even know if you can see it. It's not a big deal. As soon as you're out here, you don't notice it. Weldless is one of those textures that I don't really like, but I think it has its place. Sometimes you really don't want to draw a lot of attention to, let's say, a thruster skirt. Like you just want it to be there, so your thrusters aren't nearly as exposed. So you put it like that, and that way, I mean, on this ship it pops out quite a bit. But that is the only texture that can really get away with the unassuming single piece of paneling look. But be aware not to use any type of panel on the large scale. Because of the lack of texture wrapping, it can... I mean, this looks not very good. It's very hard to work with non-wrapping texture panels. The most important lesson I've learned over my space engineer's career is to maintain a consistent design language. Even if that design is messy. Look at this. This is visual noise. What matters is it needs to be consistently messy. What would be a lot weirder than this visual noise if I took this, if you're going to pick a texture scheme that's basically noise, make it at least consistent. Because if you only paint half your ship, it looks way worse than even if I painted the entire thing white. This looks better. It looks lazy, but it looks better than it being half painted. The most important thing with painting, it has to be the consistency. Textures and paints are very subjective. If you build something that you think looks good and ignores all my tips, more power to you. It's a creative space. This fundamentals is more to help people that were like me when I first started. No offense, but a lot of ships end up looking kind of samey because of that striped thing that pops up so much. I usually prefer an ugly but interesting ship to a competent but boring one. Personal preference, though. I also wanted to talk about projectors. Don't use them like this. This is terrible. Projector decals used to be pretty popular a couple years ago, but they've really fallen off recently, and that's kind of disappointing. I think they can really add some flair to builds. And there's a lot of different ways to use them. A lot of people used to use them for hangar doors, but they can also be used as visors and all sorts of little accents. As a main design feature, though, I will say not to use projectors. As you can see, the texture overlay on here makes this kind of wonky. It ruins the effect. So don't build your ship's hull out of... I don't know if I need to tell anyone this, but if you're building your battleship's hull out of a projected blueprint, you've probably already lost on multiple fronts. So I didn't record a decent conclusion to this video. So instead I'm going to be pushing this dog over. I'm sorry, Vigil. Literally